ora and welcome to this, the May CALT Kōrero. I'm Sarah Stein from Distance Learning. Do students really need to come to class? Are the behaviours or the changes in the behaviours of students that we've witnessed, particularly in the last few years, really something to be concerned about? Are they good behaviours? Are they bad behaviours? Or don't we really need to be bothered? These are the sorts of things that we're going to talk about today. Well, at least the panel is. So let's get going, and I'd like to throw over to the panel to introduce themselves.
Kia ora koutou. Sylvia Robertson toko ingoa. My background is in primary education, and so I guess I've always been really focused on student engagement. I teach 2 large education first year papers here at the College of Education, as well as a mixture of 3rd years and some postgrads by distance. Looking back, when I started teaching with a blackboard and chalk, if someone had said to me, "You're going to be teaching 300 students from your lounge room on from a tiny device called a computer," I would have been gobsmacked. I would have thought this is just pure science fiction. But it happened, and when it happened, something a little bit magical happened as well. And so I'm hoping we can share some of those things with you today. Over to you, John.
Kia ora, Sylvia. Kia ora koutou, ko John Williams toko ingoa. So I work in the Otago Business School in the Department of Marketing. Throughout my career I've mainly taught large undergraduate classes of several hundred students and a few postgraduate classes of a dozen or so students. So I teach marketing, I teach consumer behaviour, digital marketing and market research. I'm also the director of the Bachelor of Entrepreneurship. So I think that's pretty much all I want to say. And we'll perhaps give a slight secret away. I think there's nothing to be worried about. Over to you, Sheila.
Kia ora. My name is Sheila Skeef. I'm a professor in the Department of Human Nutrition. I have been teaching mostly face-to-face for a long time at basically all the different levels, 1st year, 2nd year, 3rd year, and postgraduate, both in large lecture theatres as well as in practical or tutorial sessions. Mostly been face-to-face, but I also have experience with distance learning as well. So yeah, I think it's interesting. It's really worked well, I think, for some of the students and for myself, but things have changed, and I think we do need to talk about it.
Tēnā koutou and warm Pacific greetings, everyone. My name is Ruth Tolmoa. I'm a lecturer at the Higher Education Development Centre, and I'm based at the Wellington Medical School in Wellington. And it's good to be here with you having this call today.
So, John, you've tempted us with something that might be a little bit controversial. You say that there's nothing to be worried about. Perhaps you could get the ball rolling by sharing a few of your thoughts there.
Sure. And I must say this position is not very popular in my own department. I'm definitely in the minority. So what we've seen is, I'm sure, probably the reason why most of you are here is even pre-COVID we've seen lecture attendance plummet, I would say. Not uncommon to hear from my colleagues. I just gave a lecture to a class that has 260 odd students enrolled. There were 12 people in the room. So this seems like a crisis to a lot of people. I take probably a overly functional view, although I like to think of it as a student-focused view. I say, what are we here for? What are students here for? Students are here to learn. We're here to facilitate that learning, and the market has spoken. The pass rates, average grades haven't really changed much over that period that the lecture attendance has been falling. So that's a kind of a blunt instrument. It says nothing about the experience that students and teachers have. But I try to think about things at first principles. Are we achieving our objectives? Are students learning? They're continuing to learn, they're continuing to pass. So perhaps physical attendance at lectures isn't necessary. We know that technology has changed. It has facilitated asynchronous learning. and the quality of learning, asynchronous, but also synchronous and online. So if you think how good Skype was about 10 or 15 years ago to how good Zoom is now, there are technological changes. But also there's socio-demographic changes. Life is a lot tougher for students now than when I was a student, for sure. The cost of living has increased. Excuse me. There's anxiety about climate change and future employment and so on. And I know that one thing I like to say is that 10 or 15 years ago, when we saw a student with their head on the bench in a lecture, we'd think, oh, they've probably been partying all night. Nowadays, it's more likely they've been working a shift, restacking shelves in a supermarket, or a hospo shift, or something like that. So I think for those reasons, it's important to be flexible and open, and to respond to the changing realities on both the technological side and both on the human side. So yeah, I think that summarises my position. Not quite nothing to worry about, but I don't see the sky has fallen in or anything dramatic has changed, although we still, of course, as professional educators, need to be sure that we do keep responding to the needs of our students.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that when we're having discussions about students coming to class that we want to think about is this whole concept of, as you say, using the tools and for what is student engagement and what does it mean. And it can be quite difficult to measure that and to assess that. And obviously students coming to class is just one component of it. Of course, we also need to cater to the whole diversity of learning styles that students have, which is some people really like coming to class. And I just did a very informal survey of the students who are coming to my class, of which is not everybody, that's for certain. And I asked them just to let me know on a piece of paper, informally, anonymous, why they were coming to class. And for them it was a kind of almost like a strategy for them to sort of stay in contact with the material and engage with material. They found that lectures interesting. They didn't seem, it was like a form of discipline. They didn't always feel that they would watch the recorded lecture later in the evening, so this meant that they could listen on. And I also see, I like to observe, is that often, particularly because it's a first year paper where they may not know each other well, they start to sit together in groups when they start to make connections with each other and kind of form friendships maybe outside of those in the halls or residence or flats. So I guess I see that as a good thing.
Yeah, I'd agree with you there, Sheila. I did some research in 2021 with a first year cohort, and the opinions were pretty mixed. There were some students that saw a real need to come to class, and they had been frustrated when they couldn't be there in person. So this notion of academic press, where the attitude to learning is kind of informed by a collective push. They talked about how going to the library, for example, motivated them to study simply because everyone else around them appeared to be doing exactly that. But then the flip side of that was we started to blend learning a lot more, providing students with lecture recordings and so on. And while the numbers in class stayed more or less the same, I don't think there was a lot of difference to prior to the pandemic. Students were able to tell us through our research why they were using these lecture recordings. They talked about how wonderful it was to have flexibility. They could study at their time in their own particular self-selected space. And another thing that was really important to them was pace, in that they could slow things down a little. And so even although it's a first year undergrad paper, we use discussion boards. And for those who are too shy to speak up in class, although they still have that workshop class experience, they feel they can share their opinions and perspectives and access the perspectives of others through that medium as well. So it's an exciting time. There's lots of different things that we can be bringing together to work with our students.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. I think both of you have brought up interesting points. Some students value coming to class, some don't. We can cater to both of those groups. I'm a marketing person, so we segment markets, right? We think that not everyone wants the same thing, and so we have offerings to suit different people. So there's that, I suppose, learning style or personality style, the need for socialising, for example. I really like that idea of academic press. I hadn't heard about that before. The value of listening to a professional educator. Yes, but also I think just coming back to the changing reality of life. So there's people who get value from physically attending lectures for self-discipline, for socialisation. But there's also, I think, a large group of students who it's not as if they always attend or always don't attend. Life gets in the way. We know about 0-hour contracts and the gig economy and so on. So a lot of them may fully intend to come to a lecture, but they get offered a shift that they just can't pass up the money because money is very tight these days. So I'm certainly not denying the value of in-person attendance, not at all. And I think one of the other things I want to come back to is often when engagement is discussed, it's equated with in-person lecture attendance. I think the relevant concept is engaging with the material, whether it's the textbook or readings or a lecture recording or what have you. And so long as students are engaging with the material, that's the relevant thing. Again, I think of my role as an educator is to facilitate the learning process. And we have multimodal and asynchronous options available for students.
Ruth, would you like to pitch in at this point?
Yeah, the nature of my teaching is slightly different from my colleagues. So what I do more is help teachers to teach and help learners to learn. So quite often I'm working with one-to-ones, working with small groups and workshops. So I was just thinking back over these pandemic years about some of the issues that I've seen, and the really rapid and necessary switch to remote and online and asynchronous learning modes has had, obviously it's a very mixed bag. There are real strong positives in terms of, flexibility and convenience and autonomy, and it works practically, as John is saying, for people who have very busy and increasingly complex lives, which all of our students do. But I also do feel a couple of points of tension, which I've been thinking about over the last couple of years, and one of them centers around the idea that when we do that switch to remote and autonomous learning, we are maybe uncovering some skill gaps. And maybe there are some assumptions about the skill sets that our students do and don't possess. So to be able to successfully transition from directed and classroom learning to self-directed, autonomous and online or remote learning is actually quite a feat. And I feel that it's really important that we keep reminding ourselves, not all students possess the skills readily, particularly our younger students, for that transition between the synchronous, real-time, immediate experience of the classroom to the self-directed classroom. So when we do the shift to self-directed learning, there are particular skill sets that I believe are necessary. We're talking here digital literacy, information literacy, critical literacy, and then there's a whole package of other skill sets around self-direction, self-management, and all of these. They come with maturity, but they also can be deliberately and intentionally developed. And so for me, I think the important role of us as educators is not just the development of content, but it's also providing intentional opportunities, really explicit guidance and coaching around academic skills and academic literacy's development to support this rapid transition back and forth now between the classroom and the online classroom.
Agree with that, Ruth, and I think the pandemic has really highlighted that for us. We can see the inequity that's out there with our first year intake coming in particular, a broad range of experiences at the school level, and then from students who started university in 2020 hoping to navigate their first year with a mobile phone and a borrowed use of the computer in the library, to students who arrived fully equipped, set up, ready to go. A huge difference. And then once you put that technology into the students' hands, it's still not equitable because they need time to come up to speed and learn how to use it. So this is something that we really need to think of. It comes back to that basic idea of knowing your students so that you can actually make provision for them.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. It's something that we haven't discussed really. We've had a few discussions in preparing for today, and just thinking of how we set up our papers and organize the content and what we're teaching them. We often don't factor in those kind of learnings, although I know the university is making efforts to do that with the students who are coming first year students, but that is a significant challenge. And I think the challenge from going from a high school setting to a university setting is very different. And one of the things we talked about is, at the university currently, we do tend, particularly in our first year papers, to have these kind of large lecture theaters where that's the style that we've been teaching. That's the way that's what we're set up for at the moment. And as much as I have gotten used to it, not everybody is used to that. And maybe Ruth can pitch in and tell us about her son's view of a lecture theater. But it is difficult in that situation because just the very nature of it is you are at the front, separated, it goes up. The whole kind of space is almost counter to creating that, fostering that student engagement. So you have to really work hard. You want the students to come closer. I want them to come closer. I prefer the more intimate lecture theaters, but then you get something big and they're all at the back. And then when you've got less and less students coming, it's even more empty. So it just becomes quite challenging. And to think of how the university can move from a lot of those spaces that we currently have at the university to other kinds of spaces where we can foster better student engagement. That will require quite a lot of creative thinking. I'm wondering, Ruth, if you wanted to tell us what your son thought about going into a lecture theater.
Yes. Recently, my son went to a local university for their open day, and he came back just really buzzing, really excited. He's year 13, and he was very excited about all of the different things he'd heard and seen, but then his face fell when he described his experience of going into a for real lecture theatre. And he was actually really horrified by the experience, the setup, the physical nature of the room, the windowless nature of the room, the arrangement of seating, how it prohibited, freedom of movement and comfort and socialization and social learning aspects that had become really important to him and had been a part of his high school experience. And I think this really leads to one of the other concerns that I have, that we need to really keep bearing in mind that for certain populations of students, such as Pacific, there's a really central concept that's at the heart of effective learning and teaching, and that is relationality. And so as we're making these moves to more independent and autonomous, as we're increasingly not being physically together in classrooms, I feel that it's necessary for us to be even more mindful, even more intentional about how we create the opportunities for good and right professional, reciprocal relationships that foster learning for Pacific, for Indigenous, and for many other students in the different forms of learning that we are taking, whether they be classroom, online, that kind of thing. So we miss out out a lot when we go out of the classrooms. We miss out on a lot of things that it's known that Pacific and other Indigenous groups pick up on, such as non-verbal communication, which happens really strongly in classrooms. And if you're from an oral culture, collective culture, it's ingrained within you to be learning actively, not just through what people say, but also through the non-verbals that are occurring. So when we extract learning from these normal social live situations, we still need to be thinking about how are our students picking up on those cues? How are they picking up on those signals? How are they understanding the social dynamics of this place? And importantly, how are we making sure that our hybrid and our online and our distance and remote learning experiences are culturally safe, are culturally inclusive, and are relevant to these groups? Because all of these things, they're key to interest and engagement. And then physical signs of engagement, such as behavioural engagement, i.e. attendance.
Kia ora, Ruth. I'm really glad that you've raised these issues. And I think perhaps at this point it's the time to remind ourselves of something we already know, but tend to forget. Lectures are a logistical compromise. They only arose for historical reasons because no one had books, and then the Gutenberg took care of that. We still only do large lectures for logistical reasons. It's just the most efficient way to transmit knowledge, facilitate learning and what have you. And ideally we would love to. I'm in my department for a number of years. We've considered doing away with lectures, just pre-recording lectures and then putting all our resources into small group teaching, into tutorials. But then once we've actually worked through the crunched the numbers of how we would resource that, it became apparent that there's just no way we could. So yeah, again, just reminding us that what we regard as the sort of bread and butter or mainstay of university teaching, once you start thinking about it, it's kind of the worst way to approach things.
Is it though, John?
Oh, okay.
I don't know.
All right.
I think that sometimes I love to go to a good lecture.
You love to go.
I know. Not all the time, maybe. Not all the time. 3 times a week for 13 weeks is maybe a bit much. But sometimes I think lectures can be good. I just think that maybe we have we've had an over-reliance on that mode of learning, possibly.
I think, a mix. We now have the options to mix. And I don't mean mixing between papers, as in having a distance learning paper or a fully face-to-face, but mixing within papers, giving students a bit more choice, a bit more flexibility, finding something that's going to push everybody's buttons. But Ruth, you mentioned before about the importance of relationality, and I absolutely agree. No matter what we do, we've got to try and bring this back to creating a sense of belonging, so that our students feel that they are engaged in a community that actually cares about them. We've talked a lot about pastoral care in the last 2 or 3 years, and most of us would agree, I think, that especially, with all classes, the levels of pastoral care have increased. And I thought, well, that's interesting. What do we actually mean by pastoral care? And I guess what we really mean by that is that we're building these strong relationships with our students. We're building relationships with learning. So we're helping them in terms of their development, whether it be their relationship with learning with themselves or with others, or with what we're trying to deliver to them, the curriculum. And we laughed the other day, didn't we? We were talking about how do we see ourselves in this space? What's our role? Traditionally, the university lecturer has probably been the sage on the stage, but now we're thinking actually there's a shift here, and it's coming from that consumer focus. The students see themselves as consumers, but we now might tend to visualise ourselves more as a guide by the side, rather than a sage on the stage. So it's a shift in thinking. Yeah.
Can I just ask, how does that pastoral care, how is it enacted? What are the practical things that you do? You mentioned earlier, Sylvia, about academic press, that almost peer, well, you know, we're all part of this. And when you're remote, when you are having to be quite independent because you're not part of a physical class, in the sense that you can't get to class or there's a changing situation there, how do you actually make it happen to engage the students or create a situation where the student feel like they're part of something when they are actually physically not part of something?
I think this is where I'd come back to that idea of mixing again. For the last 3 years I've been teaching a small group fully online as part of our EDUC 101 and 102 papers with students from all over the world, including Inner Mongolia and Spain and various different places. And I think these students felt they belonged to a part of a much bigger cohort because there was a much bigger cohort. And they could engage with that cohort through discussion boards. They had their own separate classes, obviously, because of the time differences, but they could still be a part of something that was bigger. And so giving the students opportunities to connect in a number of different ways, rather than just the traditional go to a lecture or sit in a workshop with a group of people that you maybe don't really connect with. We've got to try and find some more options to enhance that sense of belonging. Yeah, agree, but very difficult, fully distance. Yeah.
One thing we've noted is that there's, particularly with first year students, but you know, that we're able to connect more with those students through their halls of residence or sending them individual emails, even the use of text now, global text messages to connect them, following through. So there's seems to be encouragement in some ways to make sure that you can maybe identify students who are at risk and try to offer them more support sessions. Saying that, you know, I think what Ruth said is very important. The skills of the students themselves to be able to engage in those behaviors is something that perhaps we do need to address, because as you say, not everybody, people don't, I think it seems the systems are not always very clear, I think, to people. There's a lot of systems. I mean, I have trouble negotiating some of the systems. And so I think for some of our students, it'd be quite overwhelming to negotiate all those systems. And, you know, when they post something, who gets to see it? Is it everybody that gets to see it? Or is it just a group, you know? Could it be anonymous? I mean, it's just, there's just a lot of things happening, really. And yes, we do offer those, but, you know, they work for some they don't.
That's right.
Yeah.
I agree that there needs to be a combination of both what we're doing ourselves as educators and in the environments that we create. But yes, a lot of the work that I do is what you're describing, Sheila. It's the work that you're doing one-on-one with students, particularly, as I've said, our younger, but often our return to study students. And these are experienced, mature professionals who are coming back for postgraduate study in what is an increasingly different and bewildering tertiary experience compared to what it was for them when they did their first degree, maybe up to 10, 15 years ago. So these internal qualities and characteristics and resilience, as well as higher order self-managing thinking skills, executive functioning skills, self-management, self-regulation, self-motivation, these are all things that I'm working with students on often a one-to-one basis. And they're a definite need, I believe, yes.
I also think that one of the issues that we need to think about too is that when we're talking about pastoral care, is that when you're engaging with students, anybody of course, it takes time to build a relationship. And to some extent, the way we structure things is that, you know, you take a paper for a semester and then you're on to another paper. So, you know, you do need time, because I think for many students, you know, building trust is part of it. And that's why I guess the one-on-one, the contact, whether that's in a Zoom session, is a little bit more difficult in that session, or face-to-face can help with that. But it does take some time. and often we have these half year papers, and then on to the next. So that adds another kind of a layer onto it. And so you do want to have connections, I think, in places where students can go, where there's some continuity, I guess, is what I'm thinking.
Where does the responsibility lie for ensuring all of these things come together? I mean, upon whose shoulders? Or is that a silly question even to ask? What?
Not silly, but I'm not sure we can say the answer.
No, it's just contemplating. I guess it's just in your own practice. How do you manage pulling all of those things together and thinking and working with all the various dynamics, the individual students, the group of students, yourself, your department, and all of those things that, all those imperatives, as well as the paper itself, and all the things that you know need to happen. How do you make sense of it all?
Rather a lot of checklists.
Checklists.
I suspect. But yeah, it's a very difficult question, and I think it's something that we can find in the research from overseas, that moving students towards a more technology heavy, if you like, way of studying actually can be incredibly expensive for universities, because there's a real need to provide upskilling to staff, which then also requires time for them to upskill, and having absolutely outstanding technology. I know we've got a great team out the back there at the moment making sure all this is happening. So that sort of thing is just really, really important if we are going to take this ginormous leap into the future. And I think we can see that we need to. We've got the pressure coming, and each year, as I've watched the last 3 years, a very different cohort of students coming through, and they are coming with some amazing skills, and we ignore those at our peril. You know, they are now a lot more engaged in being able to use these different types of technology. They've come through a curriculum that has given them much more agency in their learning. And so how do we build on those skills so that we can help them to feel that they really belong?
Yeah, there's all, I want to come back to something Ruth covered. So one of the sort of traps of lecture recordings, for example, if they're all available on Blackboard and you can do them, anything, if you can do something anytime, you never do it, right? So I think one of the things that Ruth, I'm pretty sure, was covering that idea of self-regulation, and how do we facilitate that. So for example, the course that I have sole charge over, I build in weekly tests on Blackboard, and I've always asked my students, in fact fortnightly tests, sorry, and I've always been worried about over assessing my students, and I ask them every year, I say, do I give you too much assessment? And almost all of them say it's great. It helps us sort of keep on task. So that's, I think, a concrete step that you can take. Each test is only worth like 2%, and that seems to have big benefits for them to keep engaged in the material, and you can definitely see that in the assessment for sure. But I'm curious about. So I'm a simple-minded sort of a person. But I'm curious about what other things that we could do to build that self-directed learning, those cognitive and self-regulatory skills. And so I think I'd love to hear from, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'd love to hear from both Ruth and Sylvia about that.
I think the journey towards self-directed learning is an intensely personal and individual one, which is why I take quite often a coaching approach, working with particular students. And it's very much about gauging through just coming alongside them in a form of allyship, really, finding out where they are, where they need to be according to the expectations of their course, and then systematically just being a cheerleader and critic and a sounding board and all of these kinds of things. But I have the luxury of that in the nature of my role, the one-to-one consultations. There may be other ways that this can be done in a more collaborative sense, but for me it comes down to often helping people to find the balance between internal motivation and external motivation. So that self-regulation is tied so closely to motivation, and that's one of the things that I work on a lot with students, trying to find that inner locus of control and motivation that gets them up in the morning, that gets them doing routines in the absence of, say, for instance, the routine of going to class. How do you then get yourself up, motivate yourself to learn, identify your learning goals, go about the activities, use appropriate strategies to achieve those goals, and then self-monitor. Am I achieving my goals? How am I achieving my goals? And so there's a whole set of skills within skills related to self-management and self-direct learning. And I think that some students really do benefit from in the direct and explicit development of these.
I agree with you there, Ruth, and I think that's something I struggle with really large classes.
Yeah.
How do you actually do that when you can't get alongside each and every student?
Yeah.
But we do have some strategies, and Blackboard has become my friend. Every week I put up a little learning guide for these first year students. So they don't have to look at it, but if they look at it, they can then choose to follow the steps for the week. Little check-in as to what you should be doing. And then the other thing that we haven't mentioned today that we've got to put a really strong plug in for is our wonderful tutors who do an amazing job of working with students directly, acting as a sort of a go-between sometimes, if you like, between the students and ourselves, so that we can be aware of what's happening with individuals and roll out extra support when it's needed. So our tutors are, I think, sometimes an undervalued aspect of our of our staff, and certainly over the last 3 years they have really stepped up and provided a lot of help to students in that way too. Yeah.
And even standing back from that even a little further. Standing back, maybe not. That's not quite the right thing. A lot of the administrative staff in the position of looking after the back end, I guess, of the work that academics might be doing with students in departments are often also, they have their finger on the pulse and contribute in many ways to making sure that those individual students are kept in the loop and they're not left behind. We all pitch in, I think. People are pitching in all sorts of ways.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. This is kind of a little bit left field, I suppose, but listening to you talk, I'm always fascinated by the use of words. And in this environment that is rapidly changing, we still hold on to words such as lecture, class, and there are a number of others, I can't think of them off the head, but often they invoke thoughts of, well, when I hear the word lecture, I immediately think of the traditional lecture with one person, many people, silence generally, all talk from the front. But in reality, we know that's not the case, but we still have these words and there's a tendency to attribute certain meanings to them. The word class in the title of today's Kōrero, class. What is a class? Is it just the cohort of students? Is it the physical space? And when, we have such an overlap between the virtual and the physical, what does it mean in this new environment, I guess? Any thoughts?
Well, I think we were wondering about students coming to class. So that can be any of those that you described. It could be the virtual. It could be you know, a tutorial or a practical session or a lecture. But I think even underlying it, coming to any of those sessions is actually also, because one of the things I think we all agree on in the panel is the importance of having student engagement. So regardless of it, just the coming is part of the student engagement. And I think that is a challenge as well, to be honest, in any of the spaces. I think what I value is I would like everybody to come to all of those spaces that we have to be a part of that. That would be my ideal. I understand there's differences in perspective, but I would like to see, that would make me feel like there is engagement. Yeah, and I was also thinking when we were talking about how things shift possibly as we move from first year, where we have these kind of traditionally, we have had these large lecture theaters, but then we might have smaller tutorial groups, you know, that happen and break the class up just to have a little bit more of that engagement. But as students move up the kind of to second year, class size tends to get smaller, again in third year, and then by fourth year we've got even smaller groups. But with the changing, I feel somewhat with the change, we had a discussion today in my department about this, about with the changing with the students, particularly with COVID and the pandemic, that even at the higher levels, at postgraduate, the coming to class is still could be problematic, regardless of that space.
We've had the same experience in my little neck of the woods, for sure.
Right. So.
Can I interrupt now, please? Because I think it's probably time for us to take some questions from our audience, whether online or in the room. Perhaps people in the room might like a few moments to get their thoughts together, but it would be great to hear from you. In the meantime, we have a question that's come through online. Perhaps you've covered a lot of this anyway, but let's just bring it together again. Bronwyn from Dunedin, on the Dunedin campus, asks, there are so many ways to engage with students. Could the panel share some of their particular strategies for engaging actively with students? Any thoughts? It's quite a broad question.
I'm going to have to fess up to say I don't have any particular strategy other than to keep on doing what I've done in the past with small tweaks, and perhaps that's the root problem right there. Mainly because I don't see what the problem is in my own little neck of the woods. Things seem to be going okay. And coming back to your question about what is a class and what are lectures, it seems to me the reason why we're on this stage right now having this conversation is it seems to be the large shift that lecturers are uncomfortable with is plummeting lecture attendance in lecture theatres. Yes, I'll leave it at that. So, sorry, can't answer. Although, one thing I will say, don't feel compelled to ask a question. You can make a statement if you wish.
Yes. So one of the strategies I've always tried to employ, which it's probably seems like a better strategy, anyways, is I've tried. Well, it is a strategy that works, and I think people think that maybe it's more effective than it possibly is to try to get to know people's names. I have felt that to be very useful.
It's a big one.
And to be frank, of course, I do not know 150 or 300 students' names. That's some people can do that. I know of there in the past that there have been some lecturers who've been able to do that, which I think is phenomenal. But even if you know some of the students' names, there's a connection there with them, and I think that kind of creates a kind of sense amongst the other students so that you may not know that, oh, she knows everybody's name, which of course is not true. But I just find that really helps, and I think I do try to work on that. And that because people are people and they have a name and you want to know, and so that's one strategy that I have tried to. It's very difficult. It was very difficult. I look at Kirsten, teaching fellow. Very difficult during COVID when people were wearing masks. That made it incredibly challenging. But usually there's something that can help you with that.
Good on you is all I can say. I think.
Ruth, do you have any response to that question at this point?
Yes, it's very similar to Sheila's approach. In a one-to-one consultation, for instance, I've got probably an hour to find out an enormous amount of backstory from people, and working with them as individuals. People are people, as you said, Sheila. And so asking the right kinds of questions, showing genuine interest, genuine demonstrated care for people, they usually tend to respond well. It's caring about where they're coming from, what's on their mind, what are their ambitions, what are they struggling with, creating a safe space in which people can feel okay about revealing insecurities and vulnerabilities or lack of skills, and then quickly and constructively and positively mapping some steps forward for them. That's generally my approach.
Do we have any questions from the studio audience? Yes, this one.
Yeah, thank you for all the comments so far, panel. I suppose I'm interested, clearly there's been a discussion around this idea of moving through from an old era to a new era, and the difficulties on the back of that for many students. My interest is in what about for you guys? You know, there's this extra layer now of trying to not just keep up, but stay ahead of this, given that I could say that you're the architects of what the students are experiencing as you go through these changes. So I'd be interested just to hear from each of the panel members about how they're coping and tackling the sort of professional and academic development required to keep up with what's happening in the world.
Good question.
It's a great question.
Kia ora, Russell, thanks for that. Everyone's different. I find keeping up with the tech not a problem. Keeping up with the great ideas of using the tech is something that I really am very interested in, and in fact is why I'm here right now. And that we know that the world's changing, and there are lots of bright ideas amongst our colleagues, and I think the more that we can interact with colleagues outside of our own little academic silos, the better we will be as an entire university of learning from each other. And I know HEDC tries to facilitate this and succeeds, but I think the more we can do, the more we can kōrero, the better we will be, for sure. So that's where my focus is at the moment.
Sylvie?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I think it's quite hard to, you know, we achieved what we achieved during 2020 when we had to go online so quickly was really quite miraculous. Yes. You know, it shows what we can do.
Yes.
When we're under that kind of pressure. But we wouldn't want to be under that kind of pressure every day. But it is quite difficult to keep up this, stay ahead of the game. And what I was talking about before, about the cohorts coming through from school who've had very different experiences, and how we need to be aware of that and start building on those strategies that they're coming in with. But having good support from IT is really important too, if we're trying something different. And yeah, I'm very keen to learn more, and I do think that collaboration between our different little silos would be very helpful in this space. More kōrero.
And if both you, Sylvia and Sheila, have mentioned kōrero with students also.
Yes.
About keeping your finger on that little pulse.
I think for myself, it's a good question. I mean, yeah, 2020 and 2021 was hard. It was a lot, for sure. I think in our own professional work, we have to do that anyways. So, you know, we know that there's been shifts that have been happening. So that's happening in our workspaces, in our research spaces already. So we're kind of going with that. But I feel like there's a lot, and I certainly don't feel particularly competent. I'm just barely holding on sometimes, it seems. Like, you know, really, I mean, we can get to grips, but there's these programs and there's a lot there, and it just takes a lot of time, and I think I can see people nodding in the audience. We don't have the time to kind of invest in these things. And there's so many options, and there's so much. It's hard to know, which is why, I would love people to say, what's the best one, or what do you think works well, or whatever. So that kind of thing. So yes, the support from the university and from those who know is really, really helpful, because there's just not time to work them all out. Yeah.
But we do get a nice little push from our students, I think, sometimes, which is, I guess, what this whole session's about, really. We feel that pressure from beneath, which is wonderful. It can lift us. So, yeah.
Ruth, do you have any thoughts?
Yes, I agree. I really affirm the role of conversation, of just kōrero with each other, talking, sharing experiences, making sense together of what's happening and how we can chart our way forward. And then this collective work combined with internal work, which is, reflective practice. And both of these I found are really powerful transformative tools for educators, but they require time. And so ring fencing time to actually have kōrero, to have the sharing of good practice, to have this building up of each other, is probably something we should be deliberately doing going forward.
That's great.
We have another question online from Anonymous. It's quite a specific thing, but it links quite nicely to that one. Do any of you use classroom response systems such as Vivox? And do you think it is a good tool to use if you have used it, or the idea of those sorts of technologies? Do you think it's a good thing to use? Anybody?
I considered using it.
Yeah.
Gosh, I'm going to sound like a broken record. I can't. To me, it looked like a problem solution in search of a problem. I just don't have in my own little teaching bubble, I don't have a need to increase engagement in that sort of interactive way. It seems to be working fine at the moment for both myself and for the students. So sorry for the boring answer.
No.
I would love to use more of that. I think it's great.
Yeah.
And we do some of those things, within our teaching, and I think it can be a very good tool. And I think possibly more if you're in a flip situation, might be useful to do that. But it's just a matter of the time. But I think has some real pluses.
Yeah, I will say one more thing. I am probably because I teach. I'm in the marketing world, and that's been overtaken by digital tools. There's all kinds of tools that have been that we're exposed to as teachers, both tech tools and also practices and so on, where you can say, well, we tried it and students liked it, we liked it. Has it made any impact on the things that matter, on pass rates, on achievement and assessments and so on? I like to stay focused on the student view. What are they here to do? They want to get through and pass that paper with the maximum amount of enjoyment and minimum amount of pain, I suppose. And so I'm probably too much on the scepticism side until I can see some a meta-analysis of two of the positive impact on actual student achievement, rather than I really enjoyed this. I like to hang back,
The word agency was mentioned by you, Sylvia, and it seems to me that agency for teachers is also very important, and being in a position not only to spend time to reflect on the use of these specific tools, just one component, but also to be able to stand back and then ask those questions and then make a decision about which way to go. Okay, we're very close to the end now, so I think it's probably a good time to wrap up. Thank you very much to everybody for participating in this. Oh, we've got one more question, have we? Have we got time for one more question?
Yes, there we go.
Okay, sorry about that.
Kia ora. So just thinking about the issue of students not coming to class, we're seeing similar patterns of lack of engagement in other areas, so people not going to sporting events, people not going to concerts. So, you know, how much of this do you think is actually a societal shift? Is it really just unique to higher education? I don't think it is. So, you know, is this just the fact that people can do stuff with the internet from their living room?
Awesome.
Yep.
I'm so glad to hear you say that. I don't know if you've heard the news recently. Young people are drinking alcohol less and binge drinking less and going to parties less and all that. Social media and the internet is the causal factor behind that, if you believe the researchers, and it kind of makes sense. So I think I'm really glad to hear you say that, Kate, is to put that in the context of wider social shifts. So thank you very much for bringing that up.
Okay, I jumped the gun before, didn't I?
Slightly.
Well,
Does Ruth want to comment on that?
is there just a final comment? We have got a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
Ruth, did you want to pitch in there?
No, just to say how valuable collective conversations are, and just to reinforce what I said before about how if you know there's been anything raised here that we want to keep on discussing, let's keep on discussing it. Let's make the time for these kōrero. They're immensely valuable, not just within amongst ourselves, but with our students, as we have mentioned before, listening to each other, talking to each other, and finding collectively multiple possible ways forward.
I think I'd like just to reiterate that, and that's something that we perhaps could do better. We do have a wonderful OUSA, a student association, which is great, and I can see that there's more kind of interaction happening with OUSA. But you know, again, it's just a couple of students, so I do think that we do need to engage more with the students to find out where they're at and thinking, and that does. Again, it does take time, but I think it will be, you know, focus groups, finding out where they're coming. I'm not sure that we could be doing. I would like to see more of that, and I think that would help to know where they're coming from and what their expectations are when they come here. You know, what are they expecting? You know, what is it about coming to you? Why have they come here even? And what is there? Those kind of things need to be built in now, much more so, because as you say, we're moving to that more consumer shift, and they can decide not to come, and that has significant ramifications, as we know.
What she said times 10.
Yes, absolutely.
It's quite different. Things are definitely evolving, as we would expect they would. Things do evolve, but yeah.
Yeah, and I don't, you know, to some people consumer is like a dirty word. It's commoditizing and commercializing something that really shouldn't be commercialised. Why not just say student focused?
Yes, student focused.
We want to be better for our students, so we have to know what they want and what their experiences are, what their expectations are, and so on. So, kia ora, Sheila.
Right, I think perhaps that is the time to wind up now. I want to say a big thank you to our panel for participating in the Kōrero. I want to say a big thanks to the studio audience and to those online. We really appreciate your participation. We also want to say a massive thanks to the media production team for looking after us and all the behind the scenes work that goes on that's really hidden. It's amazing the amount of work there. And finally, I'd like to say thank you very much to the Committee for the Advancement of Learning and Teaching, that's CALT, for sponsoring this Kōrero series. Just a quick word, for the June Kōrero, we're going to have a student panel, so that should be really exciting.
Timing.
So do look out for the registration advertisement that's coming soon. So that's all from us. Ka kite anō. See you next time.